I ended up really enjoying the Apple Watch Series 7, despite it not really being what a lot of us were expecting because of all the leaks and renders being wrong, but there's a lot of different chassis designs that apparently matter to people more than they think, and the primary reason I was somewhat excited or somewhat interested in the Series 7 design being more squared off is for more design symmetry within the Apple ecosystem. But now that we've got the next generation MacBook Pros, I'm realizing there wasn't really that much symmetry to begin with, so in today's video, I'm talking about what chassis designs I prefer and I hope Apple moves forward with in the future, but also kind of identifying how many differences there really are. Let's begin. So the chassis design, what do I mean by that? I'm essentially referring to the metal that Apple uses to surround a lot of their products and have that little gap from the side where you don't look at that edge of the device very often, but you do feel it, you do hold it, you do have to interact with it pretty often. So that's why I think it's a fairly overlooked aspect of a lot of design that we need to pay a tad more attention to. Now, I said on the record for a long time that the 2018 iPad Pro was my favorite Apple product for several years because they just did so many great upgrades all at once, and a lot of people liked it because it kind of went back to that Steve Jobs era of chassis design with the squared off edges. For years and years and years, we had seen iPads that were rounded on the back and flat on the front, which didn't really quite match with most of the iPhones at the time, which were curved on the flat and curved on the back. Now, I think Apple had a very intentional reason to go with the squared off design with the iPad Pro, and I don't think it was really much nostalgia. It was more so to make the Apple Pencil 2 with its far superior connectivity method of just magnetically attaching to the side. Trying to do that with a rounded back, I'm sure it's technically possible, but probably less than ideal. Easier for the pencil to fall off, and you have to make the whole thing thicker, and that results in the iPad being heavier. So overall, it was the right choice to make the iPad Pro squared off. But then, lo and behold, a few years later, Apple actually took the iPhone in that same direction, and this, there's less motivation for. Some people think that it's because they wanted to accommodate the millimeter wave 5G antenna on the side, and they figured the easiest way to do that was to have a flat chassis, but there's been lots of other smartphones with 5G modems and antennas that don't have this flat squared off edge design. But a lot of people still are a fan of it because it reminds them of the iPhone 5 and 4 era, which was kind of what Steve Jobs left with, was that iconic squared off look. The iPhone 4, of course, is many people's favorite iPhone design of all time, so going back to that while still retaining a lot of the premium features like OLED and a full screen display and Face ID, that was kind of just the wow factor and the right amount of nostalgia people needed. So since we saw the iPads and the iPhone go in this direction, a lot of people were assuming the Apple Watch would also go in that direction. But I think I know why it didn't, and I don't believe it had much to do with any kind of, last minute fundamental design change. I think it was because of the same reason that after trying the iPhone 13, and I had the iPhone 12 mini for 10 months as well, I've discovered that Apple, as much as they do a great job with the squared off edge looking very, very cool, it feels just a tad bit less comfortable to me as something that I hold in my hand a lot, not like an iPad Pro where it's commonly propped up and you're not even really feeling the chassis, so the squared off edge doesn't make that big a difference because a lot of people use folio covers with it anyway. But at least when I'm using the iPhone caseless, that squared off edge cuts into my hand a tad bit more. However, I will admit the squared off front looks much, much better and futuristic and modern than the rounded front of the iPhone 11, and they started using this all the way back to the iPhone 6 era. That 2.5D glass that kind of spills over the edge of the device looks pretty cool in a lot of marketing material, but it collects a lot of light refractions and shows more reflections on the front of the display. But I will admit it feels a lot more comfortable in the hand. But the reason Apple probably didn't mind as much is they realized that like 80 to 90% of smartphone owners out there use a case on their phone, which it's much easier to snap on cases when you have this kind of 90-degree flat angle on the back, and most of those cases are going to be fairly curved. So this fits the perfect iPhone use case of looks good in marketing, kind of has that nostalgia factor, but the squared off edge doesn't matter if it's less comfortable because most people are going to use a case at the end of the day, whether it's leather or silicone, who cares, because it'll be comfortable, whereas the front won't collect as much light and it'll still look very fresh and new and modern. However, with the Apple Watch comes a different story. If Apple was to design design a squared off version. My theory is that because the glass on the back kind of lifts the watch up above your skin, it wouldn't be too uncomfortable, but I don't really know because I have not tried on this imaginary squared off Apple Watch that people have been talking about, and it's very possible that Apple tried the squared off design and found that some people wear it lower on their wrist than I do, and it cuts into the skin a bit more, and it's less comfortable, and because of how the Apple Watch overall looks and how much depth it needs and how the display is stacked in there on top of the glass, there wasn't really a good way to make the squared off edge design look without it coming across as kind of thick and chunky. There was already a few Apple Watch clones floating around there that kind of looked somewhat ugly, people that were trying to copy this imaginary squared off Apple Watch design. I don't doubt that there's countless prototypes that Apple has floating around, and maybe it's possible that they experimented and tested the Series 7 design with its much larger display and having the pixels bleed over the edge in between marketing material looking way cooler and the watch looking overall sleeker and having just these ultra unbelievably thin bezels. They realized that this design was going to wow more people and overall feel more comfortable without ditching the Apple Watch's iconic look that we already see on the Apple Watch app icon, and the squared off design would interfere with watch band compatibility potentially, and it was just too much of a risk, so that's why they ended up going with the Series 7. But I'm very happy to say the new MacBook Pros actually kind of catered to my preferred chassis design, which is rounded on the bottom because that's where you pick up the laptop. And honestly, I can recall pretty vividly with my older MacBook Pros feeling that kind of sharpness on the edge whenever I picked it up, whereas I don't feel kind of that hard cut, that sharp aluminum angle on the bottom of my MacBook Pro anymore, but they retained the flat top, not just for the display lid, of course, which means less light is overall refracted. It's very functional to have a flat front, matches the rest of our iOS ecosystem with the iPads and the iPhones having flat glass on the front, but also the top piece of the display lid is very narrow, makes it look more industrial, makes it look very functional, and it's this MacBook design that I would actually love to see across more Apple products. I know that right now it's kind of in for Apple to have the squared off back, but I don't like the feel of most cases, and I would genuinely like it if they curved on the back so I would have the same comfortability of the iPhone 11 series while still having the modern and fresh look of the flat glass on the front. Only a few iPhones have actually done this approach, but I have to give credit, most of them were in the Steve Jobs era. The original iPhone had the rounded back with the flat front. The iPhone 3G and 3GS had this same design approach, but the plastic on the back was a bit too rounded, so it wobbled a ton. I wasn't as big a fan of that. But actually, the last iPhone to have a rounded back with a flat front was the iPhone 5C, which didn't sell too well in its time, but I really loved the way that felt in the hand, even though I never owned a 5C myself. And of course, the bezels were thick. It never even had biometrics going for it, so it's hard to love that phone because a lot of people despised it. But this is a design trend I would love to see come back because it allows for maximum comfortability as well as less light refractions on the front glass, which I think there's a way for Apple to do it with the Apple Watch. You know, the Series 7 looks great, and I love looking at it from different angles to see the display bleeding over the edge, so that's kind of one of those exceptions where I'm like, yeah, if they did the flat front, there would be less light reflecting off of the corners. With the Series 7, there really is quite a bit. In any type of situation where there's sunlight or a light on in the room, all of that light is captured on the edges of the device, and it's kind of distracting occasionally, but I feel like if they went with the flat front, you would probably have thicker bezels overall, and I think that I've accepted it's okay for all of my devices within the Apple ecosystem to not have the same chassis design. I was kind of chasing a dead dream with the Apple Watch Series 7 because I thought it would make more sense for all of Apple's design scheme to be similar between each product, but the truth is my iPad chassis is always going to look a tad different because it's thinner than my iPhone, it's made of aluminum, and it doesn't have a glass back, whereas my iPhone, this has the frosted glass back and the steel chassis, and it's thicker, so it doesn't really line up in that regard. And the Apple Watch, objectively, if they went with my preferred chassis design for the iPhone, would probably have thicker bezels and the display wouldn't bleed over the edge, which I also think is not a functional feature, but it's something that aesthetically looks really, really cool. So it's alright in my mind that Apple changes the design and they change the fundamental look of a product depending on what it is. It doesn't all have to be exactly the same because we can experience the benefits of all of the different chassis. And even though iPads had my preferred chassis design for a long, long time, like I love the rounded back on the iPad Air all the way up until the 2017 iPad Pros, and the flat flat glass on the front felt really natural and clean, and I would be interested to see that come back, but at the same time, it would probably either have to be thicker or it wouldn't be possible to snap the Apple Pencil 2 on the side. So I kind of have to embrace that squared off edge design to appreciate the lightweight, thin form factor that the iPad Pro offers, and I love the Apple Pencil 2 connectivity. So basically what I'm trying to say is I like the iPhone having a rounded back and a flat front, and I would love to see that design trend come back, and I'm glad that I have it on my MacBook Pro, but it's okay that not everything matches. And I'm not really planning on upgrading Apple products just so that chassis can align with each other, because Apple has tons of different shades of blue and space gray and silver and starlight, so trying to match everything in the ecosystem is just kind of a pointless, endless battle. So I'm not attempting it, but I appreciate Apple for willing to have different design schemes across their product categories, and I honestly think the curved, rounded chassis of the Apple Watch makes sense for this product as a whole, and the current iPhone chassis design makes sense. Same thing with the MacBook and the iPad, so I love my ecosystem in its current state, and I don't really plan on upgrading any of these things within the near future, especially if we got like titanium iPhones that are just as thin as the iPads, and we got the squared off Apple Watch, and we got a perfectly squared off MacBook, even if it cut into your hands a bit more and it wasn't as comfortable to pick up. You'd still have your rounded AirPods, you know, those cases aren't gonna be all flat edged, so it doesn't matter at the end of the day. Nothing really matters. These are tech products. Why are you still watching this video? Anyway, let me know your preferred chassis design. Would you like the same scheme across everything? Or do you want some products to be rounded, some to be squared off? Feel free to let me know all that good stuff down below. This is your Apple Sheep here. I'll see you in the next one.